repay the wonderful gifts he had been given: life, love, friendship, good health, and education. But what could he offer? His only confidant was Helene Breslau, a professor's daughter and a rather unconventional, liberated soul herself. Raised in a Jewish household, she trained as a social worker and teacher. Their friendship bloomed over a 10-year correspondence, and in the safety of private letters meant only for her kind and discerning eyes, Schweitzer shared his hopes and dreams.
I think that one day I may have to fulfill a major task for which I will need you, and then I will simply ask you to work with me, and that perhaps Providence will lead us toward working for the same cause.
That cause arrived in the form of a pamphlet published by the Paris Missionary Society in the fall of 1904. It called for doctors to work in French Equatorial Africa. Schweitzer knew immediately this was his long-sought destiny. But of course, first he would have to become a doctor. With the exception of Helene, Schweitzer's friends and family were shocked by the decision. But Schweitzer clearly saw his future as a medical missionary in Africa. In a sermon at St. Nikolai's Church around the time of his pivotal 30th birthday, he explained,
"We must make atonement for all the terrible crimes we read of in the newspapers. We must make atonement for the still worse ones which we do not read about in the papers, crimes that are shrouded in the silence of the jungle night."
But more than atonement, it was about teaching. Much later in life, Schweitzer would tell his friend, American journalist Norman Cousins,
"I decided that I would make my life my argument. I would advocate the things that I believed in terms of the life I lived and what I did."
For the next 8 years, in between writing books and his other responsibilities, Schweitzer studied medicine. On June 18, 1912, he and Helene were married. She had trained as a nurse, and he would soon receive his degree in tropical medicine and surgery. Now nearly 40 years old, and with half a lifetime of study behind him, Schweitzer wrote to the Paris Missionary Society seeking an appointment at their African mission station at Lambaréné. They turned him down flat. Schweitzer, it seemed, was far too controversial a theologian to sponsor. But what if the society didn't have to put up a single franc? What if he and Helene could raise all the money to run the hospital for 2 years? The Schweitzers immediately set to work, raising money from their many friends across France and Germany. The following January, Schweitzer sent a second letter to the society with a much sweeter offer. A deal was struck. Their daughter Rena explains.
The Paris Mission Society, for their theological views, were quite different from my father. They were much more fundamentalist, and he was a very liberal theologian. But my father then promised him that for theology he would be silent, mute as a fish, but he would only work as a medical doctor.
At last, they were ready to set off on their journey and to begin, as Schweitzer later put it, his great improvisation. The voyage from Bordeaux to Lambaréné took 3 weeks.
From Conakry onward, we were almost always within sight of the coast. The Pepper Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast. If only that line of forest on the horizon could tell us about all the cruelties it had to witness. Here, the slave dealers used to land and ship their living cargoes for transport to America.
They boarded the Alembe, an old riverboat, for the last leg of their journey, 200 kilometers up the mighty Ogowé River. The reality of Africa, what Schweitzer called the prose of Africa as opposed to its poetry, was just around the bend. The hospital had no buildings, only patients. With crates of medical supplies still en route, there was only so much the Schweitzers could do. Drums beat out the message far and wide, from village to village across the jungle, that Oganga, the white fetish man, has come among us, and he is powerless until the next boat arrives with his charms. Those seeking his medicine should remain in their villages until the Alembe returns. In the meantime, the Schweitzers cleaned and whitewashed an old chicken coop for their office and surgery room. When the Alembe arrived weeks later with their supplies and a piano, a present from the Bach Society in Paris, hundreds of people crossed the river by canoe or walked out of the jungle to see if the white fetish man could help them. It was a daunting task. Patients came from many tribes, speaking different languages and dialects. The Schweitzers had to navigate native customs, superstitions, and rivalries. And since the sick came to the hospital from long distances, they stayed until they recovered, often for weeks at a time. They and the family members who traveled with them needed to be housed and fed. The list of ailments was staggering: sleeping sickness, malaria, dysentery, leprosy, hernias, bronchitis, pneumonia, heart disease, mental illness, venereal diseases, elephantiasis. Heat damaged their medicines. There was no running water and no electricity. Operations, like everything else at Lambaréné, were done either in daylight or by kerosene lamp. The Schweitzers could cope with all that, but a world at war was something else again. On August 5, 1914, Albert and Helene, who were German nationals, were seized at gunpoint by French colonial troops and placed under house arrest. But after hundreds of villagers protested to the colonial authorities, Albert and Helene were allowed to continue tending the sick.
Many natives are puzzling over the question how it can be possible that the whites, who brought them the gospel of love, are now murdering each other and throwing to the winds the command of the Lord Jesus. When they put the question to us, we are helpless. Meanwhile, the medical work goes on as usual. I am worried, however, about how to provide food for the sick.
Ironically, their arrest gave Schweitzer both time and inspiration to start writing 2 books on the philosophy of civilization. He was struggling to distill a new system of ethics on which to build a more just and compassionate civilization. Schweitzer took his work with him one day while traveling up the Ogaway to treat a missionary who had fallen ill.
It was the dry season, and we had to feel our way through huge sandbanks. I sat in one of the scows. Before boarding, I had resolved to devote the entire trip to the problem of how a culture could be brought into being that possessed a greater moral depth and energy than the one we lived in. I filled page on page with disconnected sentences, primarily to center my every thought on the problem. Weariness and a sense of despair paralyzed my thinking. At the sunset of the 3rd day, near the village of Iganja, we moved along an island set in the middle of the wide river. On a sandbank to our left, 4 hippopotamuses and their young plodded along in our same direction. Just then, in my great tiredness and discouragement, the phrase "reverence for life" struck me like a flash. I realized at once that it carried within itself the solution to the problem that had been torturing me.
Reverence for life encompasses all living things, not just human life. It demands respect for the will to live, and it requires compassion and tolerance for others, whether of other species or other cultures. Reverence for life provides a rational basis for determining right from wrong in weighing the consequences of one's actions.
We must try to demonstrate the essential worth of life by doing all we can to alleviate suffering. Reverence for life, which grows out of proper understanding of the will to live, contains life affirmation.
Reverence for life became a central theme of the book Schweitzer was writing and a guiding principle of his life from then on. In October 1917, the end of the war was in sight now that the United States entered the fray. But because the Schweitzers were still technically POWs, they were deported to France. The next few months were spent in Guérison, France, a former monastery-turned-prison camp in the Pyrenees. Winter was fast approaching by the time they reached the prison. Unaccustomed to cold weather, after 4.5 years in the tropics, they both became ill, Helene with tuberculosis. In March, they were moved again, this time to a camp specifically for Alsatians at another converted monastery at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Despite the conditions, Schweitzer forced himself to keep busy by writing and studying. Yet even in the midst of so much misery, life and hope have a way of prevailing. At Saint-Rémy, Helene became pregnant. By mid-July, the Schweitzers were released and headed home to Alsace, exhausted. Albert and Helene's daughter Rena was born in early 1919. It was a rare ray of joy in those dark years. The Europe to which the Schweitzers had returned had been ravaged by war. Surrounded by death, destruction, poverty, and sickness, Schweitzer's thoughts returned to the idea of reverence for life. Only a shift to this life-affirming ethic could prevent civilization from again sinking into cruelty and chaos. But before he could take on the ills of the world, he had to deal first with the difficulties in his own life. Although improved, Helene's health was fragile. His own wasn't much better. After emergency hospitalization and surgery for complications from his prison illnesses. There was a new baby to provide for, and large debts to the Paris Missionary Society to repay. The idealism and hope that had led him to serve in Africa seemed naive and futile. Then, out of the blue, Schweitzer got an invitation. The Archbishop of Sweden asked him to lecture at the University of Uppsala in the spring of 1920. The trip revived him, providing both a forum to share his ideas and a way out of debt. At the Archbishop's urging, Schweitzer toured the country, giving organ recitals and talks about Africa.
If Archbishop Söderblom had not called me to Sweden and stimulated interest in my work as a doctor in the primeval forest among his countrymen, I'm not at all sure that it would have been possible for me to return to Lambaréné.
The decision to return to Africa wasn't easy. He would have to go without Helene this time. She was still too weak, and Rena was too young to travel. The next few years were devoted to raising money through concerts and lectures. Interest in Schweitzer's work grew as he traveled through Switzerland, England, Germany, Spain, France, Holland, and Denmark. His fame increased with the publication in 1921 of his first memoir, On the Edge of the Primeval Forest. In 1923, both volumes of The Philosophy of Civilization were released. By the time Schweitzer, now almost 50, set sail for Lambaréné in February 1924, his mission had changed. Initially a private choice to serve, now his goal was a public symbol for humanitarian good works. Reverence for life, an idea born of his first years in Africa, would become the foundation for Schweitzer's work there for the next 40 years. What began to take shape was more than a hospital. It was a healing village, complete with vegetable gardens and plantations to provide food for the sick and their families. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Schweitzer traveled home regularly to see Helene and Rena, and to raise money for the hospital. Honorary degrees and awards flooded in. With proceeds from the Goethe Prize, he built a house in Gunsbach that would serve as his European headquarters. In 1931, Schweitzer's autobiography, Out of My Life and Thought, was published. Not long after that, he recorded his first album. The Columbia Gramophone Company promoted him as the greatest interpreter of Bach. It was a solid hit, and more recordings followed. But social and economic problems were plaguing both Africa and post-war Europe. Schweitzer sensed that a new war was imminent and traveled to Europe only long enough to get supplies. By June 1940, Hitler invaded France, which meant the surrender of all French colonies. Little Lambaréné found itself in the crossfire. Located at the junction of river and jungle routes, it was strategically important. Although technically neutral territory, the hospital grounds were sometimes subject to stray gunshots. Corrugated metal was taken from rooftops and turned into barricades for protection. Nonetheless, the hospital treated wounded soldiers from both sides. As war raged in Europe, Helene joined Schweitzer in Africa. Her Jewish heritage made the long journey from Nazi-occupied France that much more daring. News of the war's end in Europe reached Lambaréné by radio in May 1945. But any sense of relief was tempered 3 months later when atomic bombs obliterated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the Asian conflict to an end. Never before had the world witnessed weapons capable of such mass destruction, and the nuclear arms race that followed, a reverence for death, was the antithesis of Schweitzer's ethic of hope. Throughout his years in Africa, Schweitzer was many things at Lambaréné: doctor, surgeon, pastor, administrator, superintendent, builder, author, musician, correspondent, and host. He built his hospital, he made his decisions, he acted his way. Obstinate, strong-willed, he possessed a single-minded determination that his life would spell out his argument for a better future for humankind. It came as a complete surprise to Schweitzer that he had won the Nobel Prize